Well, last week we introduced the book of Esther by giving a brief historical and geographical overview. We then discussed the reasons for writing the book and the major theme of the book. The events in Esther took place during the reign of King Ahasuerus of Persia. We often know him better by his Greek name, which is Xerxes, and he reigned at the peak of the Persian Empire. And so at that time, the Persian Empire looked something like this. It stretched from North Africa in the west all the way to India in the east. Far north is Macedonia. And also what is happening during this time, probably right during this first chapter, right after this first chapter, is he goes on this campaign to conquer Greece. So he heads over to that area past Macedonia. And he had some early victories there, but ultimately he was defeated in a few Greek cities, and then there was a severe storm that destroyed a large portion of his navy, so he headed back home. So these events in Esther are also taking place between chapter 6 and 7 of Ezra, which we just studied. The story takes place in the city of Susa, which is right here in the middle. Let's see if I can... If I can get this, oh, no, that's not it. That's over here. There we go. So kind of in the middle of our map, Susa's right there. It's about due east from Babylon. And it was one of the citadel cities within the Persian Empire. There's an elaborate palace there, as there was at Persepolis and some other cities. And today, all that remains of Susa is some rubble. And then we also had our timeline that we've seen a couple of times in the past. And so we see the kings of Persia at the bottom. And then, as you can see here, Esther is taking place kind of in between the events of Ezra 1 through 6 and Ezra 7 through 10. And you can see some of the other events that were taking place in the world of this time. Okay. We also noted that Esther is different from other Bible books. It's not quoted in the New Testament. We haven't found any portions of it amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered. And there are many things that are missing from Esther that we see in other Bible books. There's no mention of the law, nor is there any mention of sacrifices or offerings or the temple or miracles or worship or faith or prophecy, heaven or hell or prayer. And in fact, the book of Esther does not even mention God. So there are three main purposes to the book of Esther. We reviewed these last week. And the first is to record the origins of the Feast of Purim. And that's a Jewish feast that is still celebrated to this day. Secondly, it was to encourage the Jewish exiles. It reminded them of the faithfulness of God who would keep his promises to the nation. He is faithful even to disobedient people. And remember, in one sense, we said that Mordecai and Esther, or their families, were disobedient because they didn't return to Jerusalem, to the land when God gave them the opportunity to. So they're still in the Persian Empire and have not returned to Judah. And then thirdly, it was written as an encouragement to us and all believers in times of trouble to be faithful, to know that a faithful God will supply our needs. And then we said that the theme of the book of Esther is the providence of God. Even though God is not mentioned, he is clearly in control of events. God uses ordinary events to produce extraordinary results. John MacArthur made this statement about Esther. He said, "What you have in Esther is not a whole lot of miracles. There's nothing like the Red Sea opening up and them walking across, or the walls of Jericho falling down. You don't have any of that. You just have all kinds of interwoven circumstances as God works his will He can do it through miracle or through providence. I do believe in miracles, but I believe in miracles in terms of Scripture. Today, I believe in the providence of God. I believe we are living in the day when God is doing things through his providence. I don't see great sweeping supernatural invasions, but I see God's providence accomplishing his will. And Dr. Paul Ferguson gave us similar comments. The book of Esther practically challenges us in our lives to actually decide and acknowledge the hand of God in our circumstances in life, or alternatively, dismiss those things as merely coincidence. It calls us to a life of walking by faith, not by sight. God can use the lowliest and most insignificant person, and by providence, control the circumstances around them to allow them to be a mighty instrument of his salvation. And then, as you might expect, J. Vernon McGee had a real brief and simple explanation, and it was just simply this: providence is the hand of God in the glove of history. So, thank you, Mr. McGee. Well, tonight we begin the story with a description of some of the banquets of King Ahasuerus and some of the events that took place there. So I'll read chapter 1, and then if you note down any important words or phrases on your sheet there, we'll mention them and put them on our list. So Esther chapter 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods, and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict: there is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men, who knew the times, the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Okay, so what words or phrases jumped out at you there?
Refuse to come.
Yeah.
Women. Mother of pearl.
Why did that jump out? I got to hear this. Why?
The only time I've ever heard that was from SpongeBob, so I'm really surprised.
Oh, okay. This has a slightly different meaning than.
It's a generational thing. We're still years.
Yeah. Okay, anything else? Okay. Okay, verse 1 introduces us to the first main character in the book, King Ahasuerus, or also known as Xerxes. The Persian form of his name is that other word up there, Keshayarsha, or something like that. And because the Persian, what was it? Oh, I thought you. Oh.
She said it sounds Indian in what she said.
Oh, well, yeah, could be related. But the Jews couldn't pronounce it, so they called him Ahasuerus, and the Greeks couldn't pronounce it, so they called it Xerxes. They tried to get phonetically as close as they could.
The last one, what was that?
That's Persian or Farsi. Yeah.
Is the first like a pop sound?
I think so. Yeah, it's kind of a guttural, kind of a. Yeah. Well, this is the Ahasuerus whose father was Darius. He inherited the throne from his father Darius, and that Darius was the same king that put Daniel in the lion's den, if you recall that from our study in Daniel. Ahasuerus' throne is in Susa, approximately 200 miles east of Babylon, as we saw on the map. And if you remember from our Daniel study, one of Daniel's visions took place in Susa. And when we get to Nehemiah, we'll see that Nehemiah was later a cupbearer to the king in Susa. Well, the story opens up, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Ahasuerus. And in chapter 2, we learn that Esther came into the story in the 7th year. So there's a gap between there. And this may be the time when Ahasuerus is off on this campaign of his to conquer Greece, which was just really kind of a vanity tour, as it turned out. Here's a picture of an inscription on the wall of a fortress at the city of Van. It's in modern-day Turkey. And this was commissioned by Xerxes. It reminds us of a wall that we saw earlier that Darius created. That wall is several hundred miles away from this. But on this wall, he has an inscription written in 3 languages, and part of the inscription says, I, Xerxes, the great king, king of kings, king of all kinds of people, king on this earth far and wide. So he's got a pretty high opinion of himself. And then just for a little perspective, that writing, that inscription is on this mountain, partway up the mountain. Let me magnify this, you can see that. It's way up there, that flat area in the middle of the picture. That's where that inscription is written. And then here's kind of an overall view of that fortress area, so it's a part of that fortress area. Well, from the writings of Herodotus and others, and also from some archaeological discoveries, we know that the Persian kings were quick to flaunt their wealth, and we see that here. Verses 3 and 4 give us an example of one of these exhibitions. Ahasuerus gave a series of banquets that lasted 180 days. So for 6 months, he showed off his riches, and he bragged about his glory to his army, his officials, his servants, nobles, and governors. Now, there's some thought that maybe this was the time when he had all of his officials in, and they were planning their military campaign to Greece. That we don't know that for sure, but that kind of makes sense from the timing. Then at the end of the 180 days, Xerxes put on a closing banquet to everyone in the city, and that lasted 7 days. It was basically a week-long drinking party. The Greek historian Ctesias, who was a contemporary of Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes, he recorded that many banquets had 15,000 in attendance. And there's also a record of an annual feast that served 70,000 guests. So these guys are used to having these elaborate, enormous banquets and feasts that they put on. It says it's taking place in the courtyard gardens of the palace, which, as we've already seen, beautiful, expansive gardens. Some say that they may have rivaled the hanging gardens of Babylon. They were so large and so beautiful. Well, verse 6 describes the opulence of the palace. White and purple linen, silver curtain rings, marble columns, pavement of precious stones. This was built to impress the king's friends. We, the readers, are meant to be impressed as well. But the author also wants to impress us with the majesty and splendor of King Ahasuerus, only to show us how it pales in comparison to the providence of God. And so it is with all the shiny beads and baubles of this world. They have a beauty of their own, but that beauty cannot compare to the beauty of the Creator. The display of all of his possessions was really an act of vanity and pride. There's an example of this in the Old Testament that's recorded for us. Hezekiah made a mistake of showing off all of his riches, and he was punished as a result. Somebody has 2 Kings 20, 12 through 19.
At the time, Merodach, the son of Merodach, king of Babylon, sent him boys with letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that Hezekiah had been sick. And Hezekiah welcomed them, and he showed them all his treasure house, the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious oil, his armory, all that was found in his storehouses. There was nothing in his house or in all his realm that Hezekiah did not show them. Then Isaiah, the prophet, came to King Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say? And from where did they come to you?" And Hezekiah said, "They have come from a far country, from Babylon." He said, "What have they seen in your house?" And Hezekiah answered, "They have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them." Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, so says the Lord. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, The word of the Lord that you have spoken is good. For he thought, why not, if there will be peace and security in my days?
So Hezekiah showed these men everything he had, and God knew that it was just a matter of pride and vanity in Hezekiah's heart. We see the same thing here with King Ahasuerus as he displays all of his riches. Well, verses 7 and 8 describe the drinking that took place. The king provided only the very best wine. The translation reads royal wine. The Septuagint translated it as wine which the king himself used to drink. So we might say that he brought out the good stuff. It's normally reserved for the king alone, but here he's bringing it out for all of his guests to enjoy. It was served in golden vessels, and then it says there was no compulsion. And so this meant that everyone could drink as much as they wanted, whenever they wanted. It was usually the custom at a royal banquet that the guests would only drink when the king took a drink. But here he's waiving that requirement, and open bar. It was lifted for this 7-day drinking binge. These verses also give us the picture of a king that did not want to hear bad news. He likes a good party, but he's not too much into bad news. One commentator suggests that Ahasuerus preferred to surround himself with people who were awed by his wealth and were eager to attend his lavish parties. And we get a hint of this, where there's some evidence of it later on in Esther, Esther 4, 1 and 2. Who had that? Gabe, did I give you Esther 4, 1 and 2? No. Oh.
Want me to read it?
Yeah, if you got it.
When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and he went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth.
So that comment helps us understand that nobody could enter the gate clothed in sackcloth. There was no mourning allowed. The king just didn't want to hear any bad news, and that's kind of how he's got his kingdom and his palace set up. No mourners were allowed to come through the king's gate. We see a real contrast here between the leadership example that Jesus talks about in Matthew 11, 28 to 30. Who has, somebody have Matthew 28? Well, Matthew 11. Victor, did I give you Matthew 11?
Nope. Esther 4, 1 and 2, yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light.
So Jesus beckons us to come with our problems and lay them at his feet. This king wants nothing to do with any bad news. Well, let's consider one more historical incident, one more thing that we know about Ahasuerus. I think it kind of helps round out the picture of what kind of a man he was. And this happens probably just after the time we're reading about now in Esther. It's when he goes on his campaign to make war with Greece. And he goes to cross the Hellespont. And the Hellespont is this little narrow channel right there. Up at the top of that, let me magnify this for you. Up at the top of the Sea of Marmara is where Istanbul is, modern-day Istanbul or Byzantium. And then that strait through there is called the Bosporus. And then down below where the Hellespont is, this strait through here is also known as the Dardanelles. Well, at one point, at its narrowest point, it's about 2/3 of a mile across. And so Ahasuerus goes to that point to cross over on his way to make war with Greece. So he orders his men to make a bridge across the Hellespont. And so they are, some are Egyptians and some are Phoenicians, and so they're weaving papyrus and other things together, and they string it across the channel, and then they're going to use that as a beginning point, and then they're going to build a bridge up. Well, just as they get the 2/3 of a mile to the other shore, a great storm came on, and it cut and scattered all this little rope that they had put together. So Xerxes flew into a rage, and he commanded that his men beat the water with 30 strokes of a whip. And he further commanded them to curse the water by saying, "You hateful water, our master lays his judgment on you thus, for you have unjustly punished him, even though he's done you no wrong. Xerxes the king will pass over you whether you wish it or not. It is fitting that no man offer you sacrifices, for you're a muddy and salty river." So the guy's kind of unhinged, and this is part of the portrait of the guy that we're talking about here that's putting on these banquets, okay? Now, as an aside, eventually they did get across the Hellespont. They built some pontoon boats. They kind of built this walkway across a series of boats with a 2/3 mile, and they finally did get across, but that was Xerxes. Well, then in verse 9, Queen Vashti enters the story. Vashti means beautiful one, or good, or excellent, and we'll see that idea picked up on in coming verses. While the king is entertaining thousands of his leading subjects, Vashti hosted a feast in the palace for the women. Now, we're not giving any details about this feast. Possibly it was to entertain the wives while their husbands were getting drunk with the king. Maybe it was a part of her duty as a queen. This is just the first of many detailed questions that the text really doesn't address, and so we're not going to speculate a lot, but we're going to draw a bigger lesson out of them. Verses 10 and 12 record a pivotal point in the story. The king had what he thought was a brilliant idea on the 7th day of this drunken fest. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us that Persians believed that when they became intoxicated, they were closer to the spiritual world. Some twisted sense, the king and his subjects felt that they were having a spiritual revealing experience for this week. Well, he summons the 7 eunuchs who served in his presence. They were likely responsible for the harem. It was common practice in the ancient kingdoms to make some men, often slaves, eunuchs, in order to remove their natural interest and desire for women, and then use them to supervise the king's harem. That way the king was assured they would not be tempted to have relations with any of the women who, quote, belonged to the king. Well, the king wanted to show off the beautiful queen, Vashti, to the princes and the others attending this 7-day drinking binge. The author adds the comment that she was lovely to look at. So the king proudly displayed his riches, his gardens, his palace, and now he wants to put his wife on display. She was beautiful, and he wanted everyone to know and see her beauty. But this was really just another display of his vanity. He was proud that he possessed this beautiful woman, and he wanted to show her off so that people would have a higher opinion of him. If he had such a beautiful woman as a wife, he must be really important and powerful and charming. So she would be on display so that he might receive their flattery. Paul gives us a very different picture of a husband who loves his wife. We read of this in 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7.
1 Corinthians 13, 4 to 7. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. Keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres.
So what version was that? What version of the Bible are you using? NIV or?
This is Oxford. Oxford, NIV, Schofield Bible.
Okay.
Study Bible.
NIV. Well, the NIV translation there is good. Some other translations use the word bears all things, and there it said always protects things. And that really gets to the point I want to make. The Greek word there is stego. It's derived from the word stegi, and it describes a thatch or a covering of a building. Stego means to protect by covering or concealing. So the idea is that love hides or covers the faults of others. Love doesn't take advantage of another person by publicly exposing them. This is most obviously applied to husbands and wives, but how are we all at seeking to cover or protect the ones we love? Peter agreed with Paul in this matter. We read of this in 1 Peter 4, 7-8.
The end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be of sound thinking and sober spirit for the purpose of prayer. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins.
So again, that idea of love covering. Well, the king, we see the opposite example. He's not trying to cover or protect. He's trying to expose his wife for the sake of his own vanity, rather than protect her out of his love. The king's command was not an innocent request for her to make an appearance or do some greeting or schmooze a little with the people that were there, with these princes. We see Queen Vashti's response in verse 12. She refused the king's command to appear. Here again, the Bible doesn't give us her motivation. Perhaps she realized that at the end of a week of unrestrained drinking, nothing good could come from her appearing before the king and his associates. She may have refused because it was an indecent request. There's one rabbinical tradition relating to this passage, and it says that when in verse 11, it says, the king commanded Vashti to appear with her royal crown, this rabbinic tradition says that means she was to come wearing only her crown. So in this interpretation, the king wanted her to parade naked before thousands of drunken men. Well, whatever the reason, whether we adopt that understanding or not, she defies the king. We can't read her mind, but she had to have known the outcome would not be a good one for her when she decided to refuse the king's command. But remember, this is not about a drunken king giving a vain and indecent command and his queen defying him. God is at work in these actions to prepare the way for an intervention that will ultimately save his people. Well, the king was enraged, and we saw from him beating the water that he can get pretty enraged. He punished the water by beating it. So this same king now calls together the 7 princes of Persia and Media. These men were his chief advisors, like what we would think of as a cabinet. They were men who knew well the Persian law and justice. The king was enraged, and he knew something had to be done, but maybe he realized he was too drunk to think straight, so he sought the advice of the princes. In verse 15, he asked these counselors what his options were under the law. One of the advisors, Memucan, spoke up. He told the king that, yes, Queen Vashti had wronged the king, but that wasn't the worst of it. He wanted Ahasuerus to understand that her action posed a threat to order throughout the entire kingdom. He explained to the king that word of this defiant act would spread throughout the kingdom. All women would look down on their husbands with contempt. Every household would ring with the words, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. If word of this incident got out, and it surely would spread like wildfire, the whole kingdom would be thrown into turmoil unless the king acted decisively. Memucan had a 2-part solution. First, he recommended the king issue a new law. And as we've learned before, the laws of the Persians could not be revoked. So this law would forbid Vashti from ever coming before the king again. And then the second part of Memucan's solution was to depose her as queen. Memucan advised that the king that this solution would cause all women throughout the kingdom to honor their husbands for fear of what might happen to them. And of course, it would help to restore the king's reputation as well. Well, this sounded pretty good to the king. Sounded like a good way out of this dilemma he got himself into. And that way he needed a good way out of this bad situation. So the chapter began with the picture of this rich and powerful king who lived in a lavish palace and gave long, extravagant feasts. And now the chapter's ending with this same king trying to maintain his dignity in the face of a defiant wife. Quite a change in perspective on the king. The king ordered that a letter be sent to all provinces in their native script and language, instructing that every man be the master of his household. Ahasuerus attempted to right the situation with a strongly worded letter, but it still couldn't erase the story that would spread about Vashti's defiance. Well, we come away with many questions about some of the details in the story. Why did Vashti host a feast for women? Why did Ahasuerus call for Vashti to come to the party? Why did Vashti refuse? We're not given those details, and that's exactly the point. We're not always given the human motivation so that instead we might see God at work. God is not mentioned here, but we see him working through events, both common and extraordinary. God can bring good out of everything. One woman, Vashti, threatens to cause turmoil throughout the most powerful empire on the planet with her action of refusing the command of an arrogant, drunken king. God used a drunken party, a powerful, vain king, a bold or maybe just offended queen, and the advice of a prince and the king's vengeful response, all as tools working together that would clear the way for Esther to be raised to a position of power and influence. Chuck Swindoll made this comment on this passage. He said, "This is the wonder of God's sovereignty, working behind the scenes. He is moving and pushing and rearranging events and changing minds until he brings out even the most carnal and secular of settings, a decision that will set his perfect plan in place." And that's certainly what we see here tonight. Well, a couple of pictures for you. This is by the artist de Gelder, called The Banquet of Ahasuerus, painted in the 1680s. While it is not currently on display, it actually resides at the Getty Center. So if you're up there someday, you may be able to see this up there. But we see the king, eyes glazed over, kind of rosy cheeks. He doesn't hold his goblet upright anymore. At what should be this happy party, right? They've been drinking freely. Very dark in the background. And there he is leaning over the table, giving the word to the darker figure he's talking to there is one of the eunuchs. So he's telling one of the eunuchs to have Vashti brought in. And that's the point in the story that he's picking up here. And then here's a painting by the artist Edwin Long, 1879. And this is called Vashti Refuses the King's Summon. There's actually a companion piece to this, which we'll see next week, which was painted before this. But there's one thing we should notice here in this painting. Let me magnify this middle part here.
Excuse me, Steve. Is that the real picture of Vashti, or is it just the imagination of the painter?
Yeah, it's just the painter's imagination. He painted this in the 1800s, so yeah, he's just imagining what it was like.
It's funny when you see these pictures and they kind of just look like the contemporary people.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, I mean, the artists are painting what they know, and they know, Europeans or whatnot, and so that's what they paint.
She looks exquisite.
She does, and that's the point. But if you'll notice in the background, on the shelf back there, her crown is sitting there. So her days of queen as queen are over. Yep, a lot of hieroglyphics on the walls. So that's kind of an Egyptian flavor to it, yeah. And then you see a couple of the servants over there with their,
Interpretation.
sure, yeah. But some of the servants probably looks like they, out of respect, are having their back to the queen anyway. Well, let's have a little discussion about some application questions. So, what do we learn about God and His character tonight? What do we see about Him in this passage?
His providence will prevail,
Yeah.
always.
I just imagine a lot of politicians and very powerful people, they have all these parties on yachts and clubs and places where you and I probably never set foot into, and talking to people with more power and money than we could possibly imagine, but they're still under the providence and hand of God. They do what God wills. So this is the same thing, but 2,400 years ago,
Yeah.
years ago, it's still the same thing. God is still in charge. All those plannings and machinations, and they can't outthink. They cannot think outplan God.
Yeah.
The king's ego is so high that, he didn't want to be embarrassed and had to do something to save his face.
Yeah, it's a bad position when there's nobody who'll tell you no or contradict your word. And yeah, you can see what it leads to. Well, similar to that, but maybe asked in a little different way, to get you to think about it a little differently. Where can we find hope in this carnal story of drunkenness, debauchery, rebellion, and revenge? Because that's what it is. It's really pretty dark when you think about it that way. But yet, is there hope here?
God is still bigger.
Yeah.
We don't really know.
Not going to affect the plan of God. They are not going to affect.
We don't really know Vashti's mindset.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to assume that she was not drunk. She had not been at the party, so to speak. So she may have been a principled woman who looked at it and said, a bunch of drunk guys is not going to go well for me.
Yeah.
And but at least whatever motivated her, you have to, doing the right thing pays off. And I think she did the right thing by saying no.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about that. Yeah.
What popped in my head with that question was, again, there's a lot of things that you would probably want to see happening, and probably a good reason that Vashti refused, because she was probably, around a bunch of men who were drunk, and fill in the blanks of what would happen. But God is watching all of it. And just all the little things that are happening, from this person looking at this person to the king, all the small little to the big things. God is watching it, and there's hope in that God is personally active in each of those small circumstances, and also the big circumstances that He's orchestrating all of it, just like how we are talking right now. And always think like, God must be. He's always working in every situation.
Yeah, that's a good point that you made there at the end. He is watching, but he's not just watching, right? He's orchestrating. He's using these things and weaving this together. Yeah.
I think we're definitely meant to see that the kind of person that the king is, and how dangerous it really was for Esther to approach. I mean, if she had heard this ruling go forth, as I'm sure she did, that every woman needs to, respect her husband and be submissive and everything, and she was going to go to him with something, like that was very dangerous, because she wasn't asked to come up. It could be seen as a very defiance of this law that was made in the first chapter. So it's setting up just how brave she was, and really that her life was in danger. He just made a law like that. You wife doesn't like defy or refuse the husband, or especially the king. So it heightens that.
Well, in this situation, we can see the hand of the Lord protecting her from everything that's happening with the king's activities.
Yeah, and we get a picture of the kind of guy that king was, his personality, and then the power that he wielded combined with that. Yeah, it was a very dangerous situation.
You know, applying this with the current times, we see a lot of affluent families, children, they're indulging in this drunkenness, etc. And there will come a time when everything becomes passé. They don't get satisfaction anymore, and then maybe that's the time the Lord will call them for salvation. Because in our society, in the U.S., anywhere in the world, it's drunkenness especially, the poor nations, that's very prevalent. But at the end, when they face a dead end, they repent and come to know the Lord. And some whom I know the Philippines become pastors after going through these nefarious activities.
Okay, any other comments or observations out of this chapter?
Kind of tickled me that the advisors made it sound so noble. You know, when they see how you handle, when the rest of the country sees how you handle it, you will have set a good example, and the nation will follow you. As you said earlier, you can see a lot of politicians in this story. With advisors in the background, whispering stupid stuff.
Yeah, they could have said, "Do you realize what you just did to us? How are we going to go home and face our wives after this?" Right? Yeah, they could. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me pray and we'll wrap up for tonight. Lord, thank you for this chapter in your word in the book of Esther. Thank you that while you're not mentioned, we clearly see you laying the groundwork, you working through people's motives, through their evil desires sometimes, preparing the way for Esther to come to the throne and be in a position of influence later on. So we clearly see you at work through this story. So thank you for that. Just pray that you would bless the rest of our week now and bless us as we go. In Jesus' name, amen.